She was 25 years old when she took the throne of a small, damp island nobody in Europe took seriously. Spain owned the New World. Portugal owned the trade routes to the east. England owned fog, sheep, and debt.
Spain owns the New World. Portugal owns the trade routes to the east. England owns fog, sheep, and debt. But I will not be the queen of a footnote.
I will not be the queen of a footnote. Elizabeth did not live to see what her defiance would become, but the ship she sent out that year would return with something more dangerous than gold, an idea. The idea that a small island with no natural advantages could simply take what it wanted from the rest of the world and dare anyone to stop it. It began, as most empires do, with a lie England told itself, that it wasn't conquering anyone, it was simply trading. In 1600, a group of London merchants received a royal charter to trade with the East Indies. They called it the East India Company. At first, it was nothing more than a handful of ships and a few coastal trading posts, tolerated by local rulers who saw the English as minor merchants, useful for their silver and their guns. That tolerance was a mistake the subcontinent would spend 2 centuries paying for. Within 150 years, this private trading company would command its own army larger than most European states, collect its own taxes, wage its own wars, and rule the entire Indian subcontinent, not as a nation, but as a business, with a profit margin and a board of directors sitting in an office in London who had never once seen the land they governed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, English ships were landing on the coast of a continent that already had people living on it. Jamestown, Plymouth, Charleston, each settlement small, fragile, and utterly convinced of its own right to exist there. Within a century, 13 colonies stretched along the American coastline, built on tobacco, cotton, and the forced labor of millions of enslaved Africans, dragged across an ocean in chains to work land that was never theirs, for wealth they would never see. The ships that carried them became one of the most profitable trade routes in human history. English manufactured goods sold in Africa, enslaved people sold in the Americas, sugar and cotton sold back in Britain. A triangle of commerce built entirely on human suffering, and one of the primary engines that financed Britain's rise to global power. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain controlled territory on every inhabited continent. It had beaten France in what some historians called the First True World War, fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, and India, and walked away with Canada and dominance over the subcontinent, practically for free. In London, men spoke of destiny, of a natural British genius for trade, for the sea, for rule itself. It seemed, for a moment, unstoppable. Then it lost America. 13 colonies, tired of paying taxes to a king 3,000 miles away who had never once set foot on their soil, declared themselves free. Britain sent an army to stop them, the largest and best-funded military force it had ever deployed overseas. It failed. In 1783, King George III signed away the largest, wealthiest colonies the empire possessed, and for a brief moment, it looked as though the entire imperial project might simply collapse under its own weight. It did not collapse. It adapted. Within a generation, Britain had turned its full attention towards India, Africa, and the Pacific. The loss of America, rather than ending the empire, seemed only to convince its architects that the next one had to be built more carefully, administered directly, defended by the largest navy the world had ever seen, and justified through a new language of civilization, progress, and destiny, dressed up to sound like a gift rather than a conquest. Captain Cook charted Australia and New Zealand. Convict ships followed soon after, turning an entire continent into a penal colony before it became anything else. In Africa, British explorers, missionaries, and traders pushed inland from coastal footholds that had once existed only to buy and sell enslaved people. The same ports repurposed, decade by decade, into staging grounds for a new kind of conquest. By the reign of Queen Victoria, the boast was no longer a boast. It was simply true. The sun never set on the British Empire. From Canada to Australia, from Egypt to Hong Kong, from the Caribbean to the Cape of Good Hope, 1 in every 4 human beings on Earth lived under British rule, and 1 in every 4 square miles of dry land on the planet answered in some form to London. This was the era historians called the Scramble for Africa, when European powers sat around a table in Berlin in 1884 and divided an entire continent among themselves, drawing borders through kingdoms, tribes, and rivers that had existed for centuries, without a single African representative in the room. Britain walked away with Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and dozens of territories in between, an unbroken red stripe of British control stretching in the imperial dream from Cairo to Cape Town. London became the financial capital of the planet. British railways were laid across India, not to connect its people, but to move troops and export raw cotton to the mills of Manchester faster. British law was imposed in Africa, often replacing centuries of local governance overnight. British ships carried more cargo than the next 3 empires combined, and British schoolchildren were taught to see a map of the world painted almost entirely in pink, and to feel, without question, that this was simply the natural order of things. But an empire that size does not run on pride alone. It runs on extraction. Indian farmers were forced to grow cash crops for export, while famine killed millions at home, including a famine in Bengal in 1943 that British policy decisions directly worsened, killing an estimated 3 million people while wartime stockpiles sat elsewhere in the empire. African resources were shipped to British factories, while African economies were deliberately kept underdeveloped, denied the industry that might have let them compete rather than simply supply. The wealth that built London's great museums, its railways, its universities, came from somewhere, and that somewhere rarely benefited as much as Britain did. For a while, the machines simply worked, because no one had yet found a way to stop it. Then came 1914. The First World War did not just cost Britain money and a generation of young men. It cost the empire something far more valuable, the illusion of its own invincibility. Colonial troops from India, Africa, and the Caribbean fought and died by the hundreds of thousands for an empire that still refused to treat them as equals. Indian soldiers froze in the trenches of France. African porters died by the tens of thousands, carrying supplies through terrain the British Army itself refused to walk. When the war ended, those soldiers went home asking a question the empire had no good answer for. If we were good enough to die for the empire, why aren't we good enough to govern ourselves? The cracks that opened after the First World War never fully closed. Independence movements began organizing in earnest, in India, in Ireland, across Britain's African territories, no longer asking politely for reform, but demanding an end to foreign rule altogether. And then came a second war, even larger than the first, that would finish what the first one started. By 1945, Britain had technically won the war. It had also bankrupted itself doing it. The empire that once financed half the planet now owed enormous debts to the United States, debts it would not finish repaying for over 60 years. Its cities were rubble, its young men once again were gone in staggering numbers. And across every colony it still held, a simple, unstoppable question was spreading. If Britain could not even protect its own cities from bombs, what right did it have to rule someone else's country from 6,000 miles away? In 1947, less than 2 years after the war ended, Britain granted independence to India, the single largest, wealthiest colony it had ever possessed, the one they had once called the jewel in the crown. The partition that followed, rushed and poorly planned, split the subcontinent along religious lines into India and Pakistan, and killed as many as 2 million people, while displacing more than 14 million more. A humanitarian catastrophe the empire's hurried and careless exit helped create. It was the beginning of the end, and everyone in London knew it. Over the next 2 decades, colony after colony demanded and won its independence. Ghana in 1957, the first African colony to break free, its independence celebrations watched by leaders across the continent still waiting their turn. Nigeria in 1960, Kenya, after years of brutal counterinsurgency violence during the Mau Mau uprising, detention camps, torture, and killings that Britain would spend decades trying to cover up, before finally admitting to and compensating survivors for in 2013. Malaysia, Jamaica, Cyprus. One by one, the pink map that had once covered a quarter of the globe began to shrink. country by country, flag by flag lowered in ceremonies that had once been unimaginable. And then, in 1956, came the moment that finally made it official, not to the colonies, but to Britain itself.
When Egypt's president nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital shipping lane Britain considered practically its own property, Britain and France launched a secret military invasion to take it by force. The United States, Britain's closest ally, refused to support them and instead applied direct financial pressure that threatened to collapse the British currency. Within days, humiliated on the world stage by the ally it had assumed would back it without question, Britain was forced to withdraw in disgrace. The message could not have been clearer. The age of British gunboats deciding the fate of nations was over. A new superpower had taken its place, and Britain was no longer being asked to lead, it was being told to fall in line. By the 1960s and 1970s, the empire that had once ruled a quarter of humanity had been reduced to a handful of small overseas territories, a seat at the United Nations, and a language spoken as a first or second tongue by over 1 billion people across every continent on Earth, the one part of the empire that never really came down. Today, the flags have changed, the maps have changed. But walk through any former British colony, from Lagos to Mumbai to Kingston to Nairobi, and you will still find its legal systems, its railways, its cricket pitches, its school systems, and its scars, all built during 3 centuries when a small, foggy island decided the rest of the world was simply there for the taking. So here is the question historians still cannot fully agree on, and maybe you shouldn't either. Was the British Empire the greatest force for global connection the world has ever seen, or the largest single act of organized theft in human history? Maybe, uncomfortably, it was both at once.